Today I want to discuss the question of how much diversification is actually useful, as this is a fiercely debated question amongst Wall Street's top investors, and the goal of this video is to give you a rough idea to what extent diversification might suit your personal investment strategy, as this is probably something that will differ between each and every individual. Andre Geek or Jike or whatever his name is, he made a pretty terrible video on that topic, even calling out Warren Buffett.
Warren Buffett said, diversification is a protection against ignorance. And if you know what you are doing, it makes very little sense. Your second best idea is never as good as your first best idea. And that's true, because if I knew what I was doing, I would only own one stock, maybe two, and call it a day. But Warren Buffett, arguably the smartest investor in the world, doesn't own 2 or 12, he owns 50. So even Warren Buffett acknowledges his own ignorance, therefore, he has no idea what he's doing either.
The reason I'm showing you that clip is because in tomorrow's video, I will show you Warren Buffett's point of view on diversification and also answer the question of why he's not just owning 3 companies in his Berkshire investment portfolio, as there is a very specific reason for that. So if you're not subscribed yet, consider doing so, as this would really help me kickstart things off with this channel. But other than that, let's get straight into the video. It seems like nowadays the proper use of terms like diversification or risk management became as irrelevant as fundamentals for any stocks that are EV or meme related. But in today's video, let's try to keep it simple and answer the question of how many stocks should you own in your portfolio to be considered fully diversified, and to what extent it might suit your personal investment strategy. First, let me explain 2 basic concepts of risk, as those 2 risks are really the 2 that we are trying to reduce our exposure to by diversifying our portfolio. The first risk is systematic risk. As you might guess, it is the risk of a whole system going down or crashing, as we've seen in the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. You can try to reduce your exposure to that risk by horizontally diversifying across multiple asset classes. But as I just said in the example of the financial crisis,
Apple shares are just getting hammered this morning.
Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate.
Because we're now down 43%.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
the market is behaving very irrationally, and usually in those kinds of situations we see a devaluation across all asset classes, so it is considered an undiversifiable risk. This is why today we are trying to focus on the second risk we are really trying to reduce our exposure to, and this is unsystematic risk. It's the risk of essentially just 1 or 2 companies in your portfolio going down. This could be things like the entry of a new competitor into a market, a company is forced to recall one of its products, or a company is found to have prepared fraudulent financial statements. A great example for that would be Luckin Coffee or Wirecard for all the European investors out there. This is considered a diversifiable risk, as there are a few things we can do to reduce our exposure to that risk. We can vertically diversify within our asset class to reduce our exposure to that risk. However, there's usually a high correlation, for example, between all stocks, but we are essentially trying to find stocks with a lower correlation to each other. How can we do that? I've broken it down into 3 stages of diversification. The first stage is basically, just consider it being a little diversified, whereas when we get to stage 3, this would be considered fully diversified. First thing you can do is diversify within your favorite industry. So if you think that a certain industry will do very well in the future and you want to have your majority of your portfolio in that industry, just by increasing the quantity of companies you're holding, you're already drastically reducing your risk. Bear with me here for a second, as this is extremely interesting, since this model from Altman and Gruber as part of the modern portfolio theory has not really changed over the past decades. In the first column we can see the number of stocks in a theoretical portfolio. With the second column it gets a little more interesting. For most investors, the risk they take when they buy a stock is that the return will be lower than expected. In other words, the return is deviating from the average. So each stock has its own standard deviation from the mean, which modern portfolio theory calls risk. So to oversimplify things here, we simply call the second column risk. And what we can see is that around 10 to 12 stocks we max out our diversification benefits. Now, take this with a grain of salt, as this is a theoretical concept and it is not taking correlation between the stocks we have in our portfolio into consideration. For example, if you only invest into oil companies, having 12 different oil companies won't help you much. This graph uses the same data, but it makes it a little more vivid. You can see again that the diversification benefits max out at around 12 securities, which almost eliminates the unsystemic risk, while of course the systemic risk obviously stays the same since we are only focusing on a single asset class here. The second stage would be to diversify across multiple different industries and sectors. History has shown us that the most hyped industries tend to underperform the market, whereas the considered boring industries tend to overperform the market. Try to think about it. Which industries right now are very hyped and which might be considered a little boring or unattractive, and maybe you can spot a few companies that are undervalued and might do very well in the future. For example, I would say that I can find 2 or 3 companies within one industry that will likely outperform its peers. However, I don't want to put all bags in one basket. Right now, we have tons of analysts that are predicting 10, 20, or 30% growth over the next 10 years for one industry, although we don't really know what's happening in 2 or 3 years. How can someone predict these kinds of growth rates for the next 10 years? It just does not sound realistic to me. Stage 3 would be to diversify across company sizes and countries and regions. This is, to be fully transparent, where diversification stops for me. I automatically include small, mid, and large caps into my portfolio, but this is not a criteria I use to choose which companies make it into my portfolio and which don't. Also, diversifying across countries and regions might be something you want to take into consideration, as there are definitely markets that will grow very well in the future and others that don't. However, again, my take on that is that a great company will do well no matter in which country it is located. However, you should take political regulation serious, as we've seen that, for example, with Alibaba in recent years. This already concludes today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and there are a few things you might implement into your personal investment strategy. Consider subscribing, as in tomorrow's video we are taking a look on Warren Buffett's take on diversification, and we'll take a look at the annual shareholder meeting in Omaha where he's saying some really interesting things. See you then.